Ave Maria Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II here. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I am a priest of the Church of Christ and a theology professor. This is a podcast on the StarQuest Production Network at sqpn.com. Today we're on day 167. We're covering Optatum Totius 16 on the study of theology. If you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican or frmatthewlc.com/Vatican. Yesterday we spoke about the need to start general studies, then move to philosophy which teach love for truth and response to the world, and all studies should point back to Jesus. Today, we're continuing chapter 5 of this document on the revision of ecclesiastical studies, and we are moving on to theology, right? So, as we noted above, and really the summary could be, we need to study theology well, including history, not just dogmas, in order to live and proclaim Catholicism well. So, this paragraph 16, which is the only paragraph today, has 6 subparagraphs. We'll read them in 5 parts. Paragraph 8a talks about, 16a talks about theology should lead to proclaiming and living Catholic teaching. B, theology is the Bible is the soul of theology. C, the structure and teaching of dogmatic theology. D, theology should be taught with revelation. And then E and F are talking about other Christian groups and non-Christian religions. So let's start with 16a, the theological, the one about proclaiming and living Catholic teaching. It kind of gives us the basis for the rest of this paragraph. A, the theological disciplines, in the light of faith and under the guidance of the magisterium of the Church, should be so taught that the students will correctly draw out Catholic doctrine from divine revelation, profoundly penetrate it, make it the food of their own spiritual lives, and being able to proclaim, explain, and protect it in their priestly ministry. So this is a reality. Theology is not just an abstract study. We have to understand Catholic teaching. We use the magisterium as a guide. We see it in Revelation, sacred scripture and tradition, right? That's what revelation means. We'll cover that more in Dave Airboom in a month or something. I forget the exact amount of time. And it's not abstract because it's something to live. It's something to proclaim, right? The fact that Jesus is crucified, died, and risen has an effect on my life and how I live. I must live in his resurrection. I also must live with his death and passion and death too. So that is something that's important. It's not just it's abstract. And as a priest, I need to proclaim that. And so if the seminarians need to form, so they proclaim that, so that their study of theology is not just, hey, I know all this stuff. It's good to know all that stuff, but if that's all it's for, it might not be as needed for priests. But because it's to know in order to proclaim, to live, it really puts it into practice in those actions. So 16b talks about how the Bible is the soul of theology. Let's read it. The students are to be formed with particular care in the study of the Bible, which ought to be, as it were, the soul of all theology. After suitable instruction, they are to be initiated carefully into the method of exegesis, and they are to see the great themes of divine revelation, and to receive from them their daily reading and meditating on the sacred books, inspiration, and nourishment. So one little term here, what do we mean by exegesis? So exegesis is drawing forth from the text what is meant. Eisegesis, which is the opposite, is when people put certain interpretations into the text. And if we just read it with our modern mentality, we can easily fall into eisegesis because we have certain things that are in our modern society and not in the biblical world, in the biblical understanding, the biblical language. Because it isn't just Greek or English, there are differences in how things are thought about. I think I mentioned before, I think I'll mention it later on today, that in Latin, the word scientia means knowledge more broadly. So we can talk about the scientific study of ethics. Whereas in English, the normal definition of science doesn't quite match. You have to have a non-standard, but still existing definition of science in English to talk about it that way. So that's an important aspect to remember. It's important to go back to the Bible every day. It's the soul of theology. It's the base of theology. And it's important to learn exegesis. Because not only do we not want to fall into the eisegesis trap, we want to read in the mind of the church. We don't want to just proof text it. Proof text is when I kind of come up with a doctrine, and then I just go and find, okay, this verse, proof text. I'm not taking those verses in context. I'm not trying to draw it out from the Bible. I'm just trying to have a teaching or whatever I want to say, and I'm finding proof text to prove it. And that's what happens a lot of times in Catholic Protestant apologetics. Proof text is not in itself immoral, but it isn't the best way to go about doing things many times. Sometimes it's worthwhile. And we'll see overarching themes in various books of the Bible because the Bible is a whole. It's interconnected. And so having it as this whole, having it as a daily nourishment helps us to see that interconnection. So now we move on to paragraph 16c on the structure of teaching dogmatic theology. So this proposes a very specific structure of teaching dogmatic theology, which was not so much the practice before Vatican II, but from my own theology, most of the time was the practice for dogmatic theology. And honestly is a good way to teach it, I think. But that's, whether you think that or not is a whole other question. But I do think this is a good methodological way to teach dogmatic theology, which is what this subparagraph is talking about. C, dogmatic theology should be so arranged that these biblical themes are proposed first of all. Next, there should be opened up to the students what the fathers of the Eastern and Western churches have contributed to the faithful transmission and development of the individual truths of revelation. The further history of dogma should be presented, taking into account being taken of its revelation to the general history of the church. Next, in order that they may illuminate the mysteries of salvation as completely as possible, the student should learn to penetrate them more deeply with the help of this speculation under the guidance of Thomas and perceive their interconnections. They should be taught to recognize these same mysteries as present and working in liturgical actions and in the entire life of the church. They should learn to seek these solutions to human problems under the light of revelation, to apply the eternal truths of revelation to the changeable conditions of human affairs, and to communicate them in a way suited to men of our day. So, this is how we teach dogmatic theology. And dogmatic theology in this sense are just teaching the dogmas, the teaching of the church. So a dogma or doctrine are just teachings. Technically, a dogma is a more set teaching than a doctrine, but as far as we're concerned here, you can think of them interchangeably. Every dogma is a doctrine, but not every doctrine is a dogma because some are not as definitively defined in things. But this is classes like, sacraments of healing, confession and anointing the sick, or Trinity, or Holy Eucharist, communion, right? Or Christian anthropology, things like that. Those are what we're talking about with dogmatic theology, right? It's those dogmas. So what is the order it mentions for teaching these? Talks about the Bible, talks about the fathers, talk about how it's further history, and then talk about it systematically. I think that this is important because showing that development helps to explain it, helps to understand it more deeply. And I also think, as I'll note later on, it's also important at times to explain how other Christians understand these dogmas, or how other religions that are common in the area you're working explain a dogma, say about the Trinity or things like that, because you have groups that might say Christian in their name, or might claim to be Christian, but are not because of their mistakes on the Trinity. And that is going to be talked about, I think, a paragraph or two later. And it's still systematic under Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is still seen as the master. There was a big move away from Thomas Aquinas after Vatican II, and that's not following what Vatican II said. With our new Pope Leo XIV, who is an Augustinian, there probably will be also emphasis on Augustine, who is usually considered the second most important theologian in the history of the church. And given that his community is based on Augustine, he'll probably emphasize him a little more. And it's also to see them in practice, in the liturgy, in the ministry, in prayer. And this revelation, this dogma, can help resolve human issues. It's not the magic bullet, though. It's not a sense of fideism that just, we believe the right dogmas, therefore we have no issues. No. There's plenty of people who believe the right dogmas and still had serious issues. They mismanaged, they committed sins, things like that. And it's not going to resolve every human issue, but it does help it at times, very often, in fact. So let's move on to D. Theology should be taught with revelation. And it's talking about the other disciplines, not dogmatic here. D. Likewise, let the other theological disciplines be renewed through a more living contact with the mystery of Christ and the history of salvation. Special care must be given to perfecting the moral theology. Its scientific exposition, nourished more by the teaching of the Bible, should shed light on the loftiness of the calling of the faithful in Christ, and the obligation that is theirs of bearing fruit in charity for the life of the world. Similarly, the teaching of canon law and the church history should take into account the mystery of the church, according to the dogmatic constitution de Ecclesia promulgated by the Sacred Synod. Sacred liturgy, which is to be considered the primary and indisputable source of Christian spirit, should be taught according to the mind of Articles 15 and 16 of the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. 2 quick notes. First of all, as I noted about scientia, meaning study more broadly, not just physical science here. That's what is meant by scientific exposition of moral theology. Second of all, it talks about de Ecclesia, the dogmatic constitution de Ecclesia. That was an earlier name for what we call Lumen Gentium, the church, and you can kind of think of that as its subtitle. And so it just means on the church. De Ecclesia just means on the church. So that's what it's referring to. It's referring to Lumen Gentium, even though it uses a different term. And this is important. Every theology class should teach Jesus, the whole mystery of salvation. We don't just teach this or that point. We teach Jesus. We teach to go back to Jesus. And then moral theology is based on the Bible, but it's also systematic. And even talking about the scientia in that way, sometimes science helps, right? I've written things of moral theology where I have to get the science of the kind of bioethical question I'm dealing with correct. Because if you have the science wrong on a bioethics question, you'll often have a wrong result if the medical science is incorrect. Now, and so oftentimes for a lot of things in bioethics is basically assuming the medical information I have is correct, X or Y, right? So canon law is not just law, think of the church, and then take Vatican II into account in these various disciplines. So let's move on to the last 2 paragraphs today, E and F, which are on other Christian groups and then on non-Christian religions in the area. So let's read them. E, the circumstances of various religions being duly considered, students are to be brought to a fuller understanding of the church and ecclesial communities separated from the Apostolic See, so that they may be able to contribute to the works of reestablishing unity among all the Christians according to the prescriptions of this Holy Synod. F, let them also be introduced to a knowledge of other religions which are more widespread in individual regions, so that they may acknowledge more correctly what truth and goodness these religions in God's providence possess, and so that they may learn to refute the errors and be able to communicate the full light of truth to those who do not have it. So it's good to know what the non-Christian religions in the area relate to them, right? It's good to be fair. Here, we distinguish ecclesial communities and churches. Those which have orders which have valid Holy Eucharist are considered churches, and those which are not are just considered ecclesial communities here. And it's good to know them and understand their doctrine. It's much better if a priest wants to dialogue with a local Methodist minister if he understands how the Methodists understand communion, and he doesn't just have like a cartoon version of it that really doesn't work, offends the Methodist minister, so he kind of shuts down that dialogue. That wouldn't be good. And so it's important to be fair to them. It's important to look at them for the sense of ecumenism, where you can come close together and hopefully look towards reuniting at some point. Probably not right away, but that's something to look forward to. So thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast. You can donate to help StarCross produce it and other great podcasts at sqpn.com/give. You can give one-time, monthly, or join the StarCross Patreon. Tomorrow, we're going to continue the next paragraphs of Patrum Totius 17 to 18 on understanding material, not just repeating words. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which will provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. Go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X for more information on the podcast, such as playlists for individual documents and a reading plan.